Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Conversations with Kate. Today, I have a very special guest. I feel very, very lucky to have with me the Right Honourable Lord John Alderdice, also known as Baron Alderdice. Although he likes to be called John, I always call him Lord Alderdice. I'm just going to start by introducing Lord Alderdice to you. I don't have time to read his entire biography, but I do want to let you know about some of the work that he's done. So just bear with me while I read my notes. It says here, in the last 30 years, John Alderdice has been involved in almost every aspect of the Irish peace process. As leader of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland from October 1987, he played a significant role in all the talks between the political parties and the British and Irish governments on the resolution of the historic conflict in Ireland, through to the negotiations of the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. And those of you interested in history and in politics will be fascinated by this, and I do encourage you to read more about that. In 2004, on his appointment to the Independent Monitoring Commission, Lord Alderdice was tasked by the British and Irish governments with closing down terrorist operations and overseeing normalisation of security activity in Northern Ireland. More recently, the First, Deputy First and Justice Ministers of Northern Ireland invited him to work with two colleagues to develop a new strategy to bring an end to the remaining parliamentary organisations in Northern Ireland. He also established the Centre for Democracy and Peacebuilding in Belfast to work on the cultural and attitudinal changes that will complete the Irish peace process. So it's absolutely fascinating. Lord Alderdice's professional background is as a clinical and academic physician and psychiatrist. He was a consultant psychiatrist in psychotherapy in Belfast and senior lecturer in psychotherapy at the Queen's University of Belfast, UK, from 1998 to 2010. He has also been a visiting professor at the Department of Psychiatry and co-chairman of the Critical Incidents Analysis Group at the University of Virginia, USA. And he is currently a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry of the School of Medicine at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. Lord Alderdice's main focus now is as director of the Centre for the Resolution of Intractable Conflict, which is CRIC, or CRIC, based at Harris Manchester College at the University of Oxford. And again, I will put links to all of this beneath the video. So where he concentrates at CRIC with colleagues in the Department of Politics and International Relations on analysing, understanding and engaging with the problem of religious fundamentalism, political radicalisation and violent community conflict, including the intractable difficulties between First Nation populations and incoming people. Wow, wow, wow. Lord Alderdice, as I say, this is just a little of what you do. If I were to devote the entire conversation to your biography, we would run out of time. But I can't thank you enough for being with me. I know firsthand how full your diary gets. So this is someone, ladies and gentlemen, whose diary gets filled months in advance. So let's start the conversation without further ado. So what I didn't mention, Lord Alderdice, and to everyone watching, is that you hosted at the Houses of Parliament in the UK, Westminster, you hosted the Faith and Modernity Conference. And before I speak about that a bit more, I'd like to begin by asking you what faith means to you. So just, can you tell me what faith is and how does it differ from a belief in something in general?
I guess this is a really important question because very often people use the two words faith and belief interchangeably as though they meant the same thing. In a way, they almost mean the opposite, in the sense that when we talk about our beliefs about things, those are things that we feel rather sure about usually. We're confident about them. I believe this, I don't believe that. But when we talk about faith, we're actually talking about venturing out into a degree of unknown. Because after all, if we knew exactly what to expect, if we knew exactly what the outcome was, well, it wouldn't be faith. It would be knowledge. And so when I think about faith, for me, it's a religious faith. For others, it might be different. But when I think about that, I think about a little bit like venturing out in a little boat into the ocean. And you don't know what's going to happen, and it's quite risky and uncertain, but you have a sense that there is beyond you, and indeed beyond what we know, there is a transcendence. We'll often use the word God, although they very often mean lots of different things by that, but the sense of faith or trust. Not necessarily that all will be well, but you put your faith and trust, like you do in a relationship with someone. And you don't put your faith and trust in that relationship in the knowledge that everything will always be fine, but you make a commitment, an engagement, and you trust in that. And that's, as I say, rather different from beliefs where you can write them all down and you can read about them and you can tell other people about them. And yes, you do sometimes change them, but it's a very different kind of thing, at least for me.
Fantastic. And I love the fact that you describe it in that way, as a man of science, as a psychiatrist, as somebody with this incredible political career, because I think sometimes people feel a little bit nervous about even allowing themselves to have faith. But you've described it as a really tangible part of the human experience. And I absolutely love that. One of the things I didn't mention was that I was at that Faith and Modernity conference, and I secretly enjoyed the fact that real serious consideration was being given to faith by very distinguished and esteemed scholars and learned people and religious leaders. It was nice to hear faith discussed as an operational component of government, and we discussed at the conference this idea of faith having room at the table. My question, therefore, Lord Alderdice, is why don't we hear more from faith leaders when it comes to thrashing out sort of societal issues that we have to deal with every day?
I think there are a number of reasons for it. One of them is that during the period of the Enlightenment and going on from that time, people began to believe that the only really significant, relevant, dependable component of us as human beings was our rationality, our capacity to think in a rational way and to argue and debate rationally, but also to investigate in a rational way. And so you saw the development from Galileo onwards, indeed, arguably from a little before that, what we regard as the scientific method. And you would try to get the evidence and test that and so on and so on. Well, people then got to the point of believing that kind of investigation really brought the only valuable set of understandings of things. And anything that didn't conform to rationality or to the scientific method wasn't really a fact. And if it wasn't a fact, it was a fantasy. And if it was a fantasy, it really didn't mean anything at all, and you could dismiss it. Now, the truth is that although people believed these things, said these things, often thought about these things, they very rarely actually lived their lives personally holding to those kinds of views. Because, of course, if you're talking about a relationship with someone, that relationship can't be investigated in a scientific way as one might investigate the stars, or one might investigate a chemical property of some material, because it has relationship, it has emotions, it has values, it has a whole raft of things that aren't susceptible to that kind of way of thinking. But that way of thinking went on for a long time, still continues for many people. But I think over the last number of years, people have begun to question that and say, well, it's very valuable, it's very important, huge developments have taken place. But is it the only way that we think? Well, clearly not. Is it the only thing that's important in conducting human affairs? Well, probably not. And so we begin to find people exploring things in a slightly different way, in a more open way, a way that, first of all, pays attention to emotions as well as to facts and knowledge and understanding. That begins to understand that when we think about things, when we get, for example, very passionate about something, even about something scientific, we're not necessarily behaving in an entirely logical and rational way. We may spend far, far too much time thinking about and reading about and experimenting on some scientific matters that, in a way that really doesn't add up as far as my own personal best socioeconomic interests are concerned. And indeed, we've, of course, in the last 20 years or so, begun to pay a lot of attention to the fact that people are sometimes prepared to go and sacrifice their own lives, the lives of their families, and to take away the lives of other people for things they believe in, which may not be in their best socioeconomic advantage at all. And initially, people just said, oh, well, they're crazy people and they're bad people and so on. But some of us that have been trying to investigate these things have had to say, well, no, wait a minute. It's not enough to just dismiss these people. They're there, and we have to pay attention to that. And actually, if you do pay attention and you do take it seriously, then much better possibilities can emerge. And that's really what happened in the Irish peace process, when we, instead of dismissing people that were involved in terrorism, we said, well, you're breaking the law, people are suffering, that's terrible, but let's try to understand why you're doing that and see if there isn't another way of exploring these things. And I notice, you mentioned the House of Lords, I notice in the way over 20 years that I've been there now, we've moved from a place where very few parliamentarians ever talked about their beliefs and especially about their faith, even though there were a number of bishops there. And now we begin to find people a little bit more prepared to speak about those things. You can overburden it. You can deal with it in a way which is not healthy. But I think dismissing it isn't healthy either. And I'm a little bit encouraged that people are becoming more open to thinking about these things.
I am too. I mean, I certainly walked away from the conference that you hosted feeling that, in considering things I hadn't considered before, in just hearing the way that faith itself was discussed. One of the things I do want to ask, though, is do you believe that there will ever be given serious consideration to the level of there being commissioned research or some committee being formed that actually investigates the potential or the role that faith plays, certainly on a practical basis in people's everyday lives, and how it impacts the way that people are able to function as a society? Will we see that day, do you think?
Oh, I've no doubt that we will. And we're already seeing that kind of thing taking place in academic research establishments, and not necessarily by people who are themselves believers in the importance of faith, other than that it's quite clearly an important part of the human condition. So a number of my colleagues in Oxford, for example, who would say, well, I'm not religious at all, I'm very skeptical of all of this, I'm not what you might call a believer in any way, but what is absolutely clear is that I can observe that people are prepared to fight and die and sacrifice themselves because of these things. Therefore, there must be something important about it. And therefore, I must do some, if I'm an academic researcher, I must do some academic research to try to tease out what this is. So I think even amongst people who are not in any way believers in these things, they still believe that there's something important about it, because manifestly, these are drivers for people from right across the world, for good and ill. I mean, some of these drive people to make personal sacrifices for very positive reasons and with very positive outcomes. And you get the other side of it as well, that people make sacrifices and wreak terrible havoc. But I think it's also true that some people in what you might call the theological or divinity or whatever field are themselves beginning to say to me in the last few years, I'm beginning to see a greater interest in these matters amongst young people. Some of them are young people who are saying, well, I myself and others that I know are coming from different cultural and religious perspectives, and we want to try to understand, why do we differ? What are the common features? Can we understand each other better? Is it necessary and important, maybe, that we see things from different perspectives? Some people would like everybody to believe the same thing. Other people say, well, actually, it's quite important that we don't all believe the same thing, because there are very different perspectives. It's like a diamond doesn't sparkle if you just polish up one facet. You've got to polish up all the different facets to bring a real sparkle to it. So I get the sense from colleagues that this is becoming more of a matter of interest. I think politicians find it much more difficult to know how to address these things. But one thing that is clearly a matter of concern and is spoken about and addressed, and funding is being given to it, and that is the protection of different beliefs, and indeed of those who do not want to have any particular religious belief, that people should have that right to have a belief which is religious or a belief that is not religious, and that right should be protected. Now, recently, when people have talked about that, particularly at the United Nations, they've been talking about the protection of religions, or the protection of the right of countries sometimes, or communities, to maintain a particular religion. That's a totally different thing. What I'm speaking about is the right of individuals to differ from the majority of people in their community, religiously, politically, and so on and so on, which is almost the opposite of the protection of religions. To be honest, religions don't need protective. There's plenty of protections already for the vast majority of them. But individual people in countries that are hostile to those particular religions, well, they do need the protection that allows them to hold to their views and to be protected in not just thinking about their views, but being able to speak with others and to celebrate their views.
That's so fascinating, and I have so many things as you're talking, so many different ideas. I understand what you're saying very clearly, and it seems to me that certainly at a policy level, investigating these protections could be a gateway for somebody who wanted to engage their government on a conversation, or somebody who wanted to make a proposal for research or for establishing a committee of some type. Because I certainly, in my experience, I think politicians can get their teeth stuck into things like religious extremism, which is something that you've been involved with, terrorism, radicalization, and all of that. Those are things that are easy to get your teeth stuck into. But if it's just a question of, I want to look at how faith impacts the man on the street every day and its role in the way that society functions, it's perhaps trickier to be taken seriously. So how might someone present such an argument? If, for example, I knew you headed some committee in Parliament that was looking at something, let's say, like the policy on protections, how could I introduce new research, new ideas, new concepts to you as a member of the person on the street, an average person?
Sure. I have the feeling that there's a gradual process here where, first of all, people in politics have to take seriously the role of religion because of all the downsides, if you like, the business of fundamentalism and terrorism. So then people make another little bit of a step and they begin to say, well, of course, there are also positive things and upsides. And what's really important is that we protect freedom of religion or belief. And we give some time and some funding and so on to doing that. And I think that's the place that we're at now, where people realize it's really important to protect freedom of religion and belief. And of course, that's an important article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So governments are sometimes prepared to give funding for that. And indeed they are. And we've applied for and are beginning to get some funding for that. I think taking it to the next step of exploring the role that it plays in people's lives, I'm not sure that we're quite at that point now, not least because people are very preoccupied with the immediate challenges of the coronavirus, Brexit, environmental degradation, and, although it doesn't get as much talk as it perhaps should, the real dangers of some kind of nuclear conflict. Now, these are all enormous challenges, and politicians only have a certain bandwidth. They can only cope with a certain number of issues at any particular time. But I think one of the things that may make it easier to address these things, academically certainly, but maybe even in terms of politics, is that I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that one outcome of COVID-19 may well be many people in different parts of the world trying to look for a sense of meaning behind all of this. And they will come up with all sorts of different ideas. Some of them will be going back to previous ways of thinking religiously. Some of them will be very creative and novel. Some will arise for a short time and then disappear. But I just have the sense that one of the phenomena which we will see is people, young and old, looking to issues of faith, belief, that go beyond what is the normal element of thinking in politics and in philosophy and so on, to look at something that's more transcendent, that's about meaning in their lives as individuals and as whole communities. And of course, the religious communities are having to rethink some things too, because they're unable to come together to worship. And it's just not quite the same thing trying to conduct worship on Zoom or WhatsApp or any of these kinds of things. So religious communities are having to become more thoughtful and creative, and people in general are being challenged about the meaning and significance of these kinds of events. Now, does that mean that somebody could come along and make an application to Parliament and they will give them money to do research? No, because Parliament itself does not tend to commission research in that kind of way. That's the kind of thing that academic departments and so on do. But is it possible that at some point a committee might begin to be prepared to address that sort of an issue? I think that is perfectly possible. And of course, as you will know, because you've spent time in London and in Westminster, there are also all-party parliamentary groups, which are not part of the legal process, but they are an opportunity for parliamentarians to come together and look at these things. And there is an all-party parliamentary group on religion. And so that might be the kind of place that might be more easily able to look at these sorts of things than Parliament and government themselves.
Thank you so much, because I receive, through the work that I do, so many questions, and there are people who are interested in politics and interested in research and are passionate about what they believe and are looking for sort of inroads to getting their ideas taken seriously. I did say in my previous question, man on the street, I didn't mean that. I meant actually like a researcher, somebody who is engaged in this sort of work. So that's very interesting. And it's interesting what you say as well. Before I talk about the peace process, which I want to do in a moment, you talk about religious communities and the sort of challenges they're facing under COVID-19. There was a retired professor who asked on Facebook over in America, is it prudent for religious groups to disperse and to not come together? Or can we really muster up the faith in this unseen force that we are supposedly believe in and pray this away or believe that we'll be safe? So my question, and it is a serious question, is do you ever feel that sort of, for some people that's radical, for the average, I think, Christian with real religious zeal and fervor, that's not radical, the idea of believing in God and believing that God has power to do things such as get rid of a COVID-19 pandemic. Do you ever think that way of thinking will ever become mainstream?
Well, there are a number of questions that are raised by what you say. The first thing is that when someone, as you described, gets terribly worried that religion's going to get into awful difficulties because people can't meet together and so on, my response to that is to say, well, it must be a very weak kind of religious conviction that you're talking about, because if you believe that the engagement is with a transcendent God, if we use that word, then we don't need to be protecting him or her, or whatever word you use to describe God. We don't need to be protecting or anything of that kind. What we need to be doing is opening our minds and ourselves up to understand what it is that's going on at the moment. Now, in that context, the idea that we should be praying away the pandemic, it seems to me that there are lots of ways that we can address the question of a pandemic. To simply blot out of your mind that there is actually something biological going on here, and that you should be paying attention to that, and that's one of the capacities that we have developed as human beings, the understanding that we live in a universe that has order and structure, and therefore we can explore these things and find better ways, then that's an important part of the faith endeavor. And one of the things that's really positive and interesting is the way that many religious people have come to be more thoughtful and respectful of science. A few days ago, we had the centenary of the birth of Pope St. John Paul II. And one of the enormous things that John Paul did was to make great steps forward in rebuilding, or perhaps one should even say building, the relationship between faith and science. He had an investigation done about how the church had dealt with Galileo Galilei 400 years before. And in the end, he said, look, the church got it wrong. And we have to repair that. And let's be very clear that when we come to something like evolution, People have thought about it, they've looked at it, and theologians have to take this seriously and not just dismiss it and go off in their own way. So I think we're in a developing new place where instead of people saying, oh, we should forget about medicine, forget about science, just have a prayer meeting, that's going to solve the problem. I don't think that does justice to faith, and I don't think it does justice to any other aspects of humanity. We have all sorts of possibilities for how we may deal with these things, and we should be bringing them all together and respecting each other on. But of course, we also know there are limits to what science and medicine is able to achieve now, and perhaps will ever be able to achieve. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, how do I accommodate myself to those kinds of realities as an individual and as a community? How do I deal with all the difficulties, the pain, and also the joy and excitement of being able to get through some of these problems? How do I address that? Now, I think that's very challenging, but it is also exciting because it can take us to new ways of thinking about things. And I must say, a few years ago, I began to get quite down about what the possibilities were. It looked to me as though everything was going in a very bad way. And in many ways, it is going in a very bad way. But I can begin now to see new possibilities. And so that gives me a much more positive sense of what is possible.
I'm absolutely certain, Lord Alderdice, that people hearing those remarks from you are going to be very encouraged indeed. And I am somebody who believes that this is a personal endeavor. I hold what some will believe may consider to be very radical views, but those are my beliefs because they're based on what I know from personal experience. However, I do recognize the role of the physical world. So I am somebody who is not dismissive in any way of the order and structure in which we exist. So I'm so glad that you responded to my question in that way. I want to actually go on now to the peace process, because this is something that many people will be aware of, conflict around the world. It's something that has real world implications for everybody. It impacts people in the most devastating of ways sometimes. But I would like to ask, not about the peace process itself, because people can read more about your work on that front, but what would you say the role of faith, if any, has been in the peace process, in finding solutions and looking for resolutions to the sort of intractable conflicts that you have encountered throughout the course of your career?
In a way, this takes us back to where we started with faith and belief. Because when people have very specific beliefs, whether those are religious or political or whatever, it very often brings them into conflict with other people. And people say, well, I believe this and you believe that, and those two things can never come together, and we really just have to fight it out until either you win or I win. When we talk about faith, when we talk about engagement with the transcendent, we're talking about a relationship. We're talking about a relationship with the wider world, with that which goes way beyond the world and even transcends it. And one of the things that became apparent to those of us who were working in Ireland, North and South, and indeed in relationships with Britain, was that what we were really dealing with wasn't political beliefs just. It wasn't just questions of policing and the administration of justice or human rights or economic disadvantage or whatever. All of these are parts of the issue. The fundamental problem was that we had disturbed historic relationships between communities of people. And what we had to do was become aware of how and why they had become disturbed, but to focus on what were the important relationships. So, for example, when I came into political life, what people would say in Britain, in the rest of Ireland, in America, in Europe, they would say, oh, well, you know, these people in the North, Protestants and Catholics, you know, it's hopeless altogether. If only they would see sense and be rational and logical and reasonable, it could all be sorted out. We began to say, no, wait a minute. First of all, it's about relationships. But it's not just about disturbed relationships within Northern Ireland, because there are disturbed relationships between North and South, and between Britain and Ireland, and more widely. So what we have to do is talk about those disturbed historic relationships, get people to talk about how they feel about these things that happened in the past, and how and whether they want to have a better network of relationships. And so that even those who are standing outside saying, oh my goodness, isn't this crazy? And so you say, no, 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 you're part of the issue as well. You have to come in and listen and talk and realize you're part of this wider network of relationships, this complexity, this network of engagement. Once we started to do that and people started to get engaged from outside just Northern Ireland itself, the situation began to change because people really did want to make a difference. They really did want to bring it to an end. They were very tired of it all, the personal, emotional, financial, economic, security costs. And so they were prepared to engage in trying to find a new kind of relationship, a new set of relationships. And for me, that issue of relationships in any of these situations is the absolutely key one. So if I go to the Middle East, it's not a question of are the Israelis right? Are the Palestinians right? Or which is it? Who has more right than the other? Nothing to do with that at all. And it's not a matter of backing one side against the other. So no, let's look at the relationship between you and with the rest of the people in the region and beyond. And let's try to figure out why did it go badly wrong? And do you want a better relationship? Now, if you tell me, no, we don't want a better relationship, we just want to fight out to the death. Well, not a lot I can do about that, but maybe as time goes on, some younger people will begin to say, well, actually, we don't want to continue to live with it. But my own experience has been when you begin to talk to people and listen to people in this kind of area, people begin to be more interested and more prepared to engage, because in the end, all of us know that life is about relationships or it's about nothing.
Fantastic. I think that's just an absolutely wonderful way to resolve this conversation. To wrap it up, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed it. By the way, I've tried to keep myself composed, but just to end, taking yourself out of this important role that you have, just as John Alderdice, what are your feelings about the prospects of peace? Will we as a global community ever get there, do you think? That's my final question.
Well, Kate, it's lovely to talk with you again, as it always is. And what I would say is this. What we discovered in Ireland was not that we could all reach agreement, but that we could find ways of disagreeing without killing each other. I don't think that even in principle, we can ever get to a place where we all agree, where we all see things from the same perspective, where we all have the same sets of values and culture. I don't think we ever get to that point, nor should we, nor maybe should we even try, because it only sets up the problem. What we need to do is find a way in which we can listen to and respect the different perspectives that there are, and use that to build our relationships, individuals, of course, but as whole communities that take us forward as a global community, not to a point where we all agree, but to a place where we can all live together and respect each other. And I suppose that's what still fires me up, even after all this time.
Lord John Alderdice, I can't thank you enough for being part of this conversation with Kate. Thank you very much. As I've said to the audience, I will put links to Crick and to your biography and other things that I consider to be important for those who really have a passion for politics and for science and whatever else it might be. They can read up more about the incredible work that you've done. I can only say thank you again for your time. It's been an absolute delight talking to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.